The story begins with the kind of hook that pulls anyone straight into the chaos, because what happened on that morning wasn't just petty HOA drama, it was the exact moment where a simple parking misunderstanding turned into a full neighborhood scandal. Before the story unfolds, the narrator invites the viewer to share which country they're watching from and encourages them to like and subscribe for more stories, because this one is the type people talk about long after the screen fades. The day had started calm. The kind of calm that made the neighborhood look picture perfect from the outside, even though anyone living inside those lines knew the homeowners association watched everything like hawks circling a field. The main character had dealt with the board more times than he could count, but nothing could have prepared him for what the board member named Cheryl decided to pull. She was the type who measured her worth in citations and saw every parked car as a personal enemy. The car in question sat neatly in the driveway, right where it always sat when it wasn't in the garage. A slow leak in the roof had led to tools and parts scattered across the garage floor while repairs were in progress, so pulling the car inside wasn't possible for a few days. The arrangement seemed harmless. After all, the HOA rules allowed driveway parking. The problem wasn't the rule. The problem was that Cheryl lived 3 houses down and loved enforcing her own interpretations. That morning, she marched across the street with her phone already in her hand. Her brisk steps, tense shoulders, and clipped posture made it clear she wasn't coming over for a friendly chat. She scanned the car like a crime scene investigator who believed she had discovered evidence that would change the world. She fixated on one simple detail. The car looked, to her, like it had never belonged in the neighborhood at all, even though it was registered, insured, and owned by the very homeowner who lived there. She believed she had cracked a case of unauthorized parking. She dialed 911. The call was made with confidence. She believed she was preventing a violation serious enough to involve emergency services. She claimed there was an abandoned car blocking a driveway, a suspicious vehicle left on private HOA property, and possibly even a trespasser associated with it. Her voice had that self-righteous tone that came from someone who was certain they were saving the community. Police arrived within minutes. They pulled up with lights flashing, drawing the attention of half the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peeked through blinds, pretending they weren't looking, while fully investing in whatever drama was unfolding. Others stepped outside pretending to check their mail, even though they had checked it an hour earlier. It didn't take long before nearly the entire street became an audience. The homeowner stepped outside just in time to see officers circling the car. The officers treated it as a legitimate situation because the 911 call had been made with urgency. They approached the board member first, jotting down notes as she pointed at the car and spoke with animated hand gestures. The mixture of pride and satisfaction across her face made it clear she believed she had struck gold and that her actions would surely earn her praise at the next HOA meeting. She insisted the car never belonged there. She claimed the homeowner rarely used it, so that meant it must have been abandoned. She argued the association had rights to tow the vehicle since it created an eyesore. She explained that she had no choice but to call emergency services since this was a serious concern for the community. The officers walked toward the homeowner next. Their questions were calm and procedural. They explained the report they received, the concerns raised, and that they needed to verify the situation. The homeowner felt a mix of disbelief and frustration settle in. The idea that a neighbor had escalated something so minor into a police matter made no sense, but the moment to prove everything was approaching, and it would arrive in the simplest way possible. The garage door. The officers needed proof the homeowner lived there and proof the car belonged. When the homeowner walked up to the garage door and pulled out the opener, the moment became almost cinematic. A single click sent the door rising smoothly, revealing tools, parts, and evidence of the ongoing repairs. The car clearly belonged. Everything lined up with the homeowner's explanation. The officers nodded as the truth settled in. The call that had been made with such urgency instantly lost all weight. The police realized they had been dragged into an HOA dispute disguised as an emergency. The car wasn't abandoned, it wasn't suspicious, it wasn't violating any rules. The entire situation was nothing more than a board member trying to overstep her power. The shift in energy around the cul-de-sac was immediate. Neighbors who had been watching tried to look casual again. Some backed quietly into their homes, pretending they had never been invested in the show. Others watched more intently, waiting to see what kind of fallout would land on Cheryl for misusing emergency services. Cheryl stood frozen. The confidence drained from her expression the moment the garage door revealed the truth. She tried to recover by blaming outdated rules and community safety needs, but the officers didn't entertain the excuses. The homeowner didn't even need to argue. The evidence spoke loud enough. The officers gave one last look at the car, wrote down a brief summary for their records, and prepared to leave. They didn't reprimand the homeowner. They didn't cite anything. Instead, their questions shifted toward whether this kind of behavior from the board member happened often, suggesting they recognized the deeper issue. When the officers drove away, the board member stayed behind with a tight jaw and trembling frustration. She had expected to win, and instead she had embarrassed herself. But in her frustration, she began plotting something bigger, something that would push the homeowner further than before, something that would turn an unnecessary 911 call into the foundation of a neighborhood war. The following day began with a strange kind of quiet that rarely settled over the neighborhood. The sun had barely climbed up, and the streets were still empty, yet there was a heavy sense of expectation in the air. Word traveled fast in communities ruled by an HOA, and the incident from the night before had already become the first topic of every porch whisper and early morning jog. Neighbors who usually never noticed anything had suddenly become extremely invested in who parked where and whether the board had overstepped. The narrator stepped out of the house with the garage opener still in his pocket, knowing it would become the center of everything soon. The small device felt oddly significant now, almost like a key piece of evidence in a trial he never agreed to participate in. The garage door still showed the faint marks from where the tow operator had tried to wedge tools into the track, evidence of how determined the board member had been. The driveway carried a small crowd of onlookers, as though the entire community was waiting to see the next chapter unfold. Some stood casually with coffee cups, others pretended to check their mail, a few walked their dogs in slow circles, all trying to appear as though they just happened to be there by coincidence. But their attention was fixed on the homeowner, on the garage, and on the aftermath of the chaos that the board member had triggered. The HOA board member, Patricia, had not shown herself yet, but the community's curiosity filled the gap she left behind. People wanted to see if she would continue pushing her narrative or if she would finally step back after being proven wrong. She had always carried herself like an unchallenged authority, certain that her word was the rule book, and this was the first time anyone had ever seen evidence that contradicted her so publicly. The morning unfolded slowly. The narrator went about routine tasks knowing the quiet would not last. The HOA didn't let situations die naturally. Everything escalated. Everything became a matter of rules and interpretations and power plays. It was only a matter of time before the board attempted to regain control of the story. By noon, an email alert buzzed. The subject line carried its familiar tone. Mandatory HOA discussion, urgent. The homeowner opened it and scanned the message. The board had scheduled an emergency community meeting for that evening. The topic was, unsurprisingly, parking violations and enforcement procedures. They framed it as an attempt to preserve order, but the subtext was clear. They wanted to redirect the fallout. They wanted to paint last night as a misunderstanding, or better yet, a justified attempt to enforce rules that supposedly kept the neighborhood stable. The homeowner felt a mix of frustration and amusement. A single wrong accusation should have ended with an apology, but instead, the board had chosen to double down. Typical HOA behavior. They hoped to talk circles around the truth until people forgot what actually happened. But the garage opener was still in the homeowner's pocket, and the video footage of the car entering the garage remained untouched. Facts would not fade simply because the board wanted them to. The hours before the meeting moved quietly but with tension building. Several neighbors approached the homeowner, privately. Some offered sympathetic nods, the kind that signaled they knew the board had made a mistake. Others hinted at wanting to support him during the meeting, but still feared retaliation from Patricia and her allies. People have lived under the board's grip long enough to know how they operated. Dissent was punished indirectly. Fines doubled. Yard inspections suddenly increased. Every neighbor knew someone who had been targeted after speaking up. The homeowner reassured them without speaking, offering calm gestures and steady expressions. He didn't want to drag anyone else into the board's theatrics. He would handle the meeting himself. By early evening, the neighborhood clubhouse filled with people. Plastic chairs lined the room, forming an imperfect circle. The walls were decorated with flyers for yard maintenance standards, reminders about trash can placement, and notes about seasonal decoration limits. It looked like a shrine to micromanagement. The board members sat at the front, with Patricia in the center. She had recovered her composure and wore the expression of someone ready to defend her version of events with absolute conviction. The rest of the board mirrored her posture, preparing to back whatever narrative she delivered. The meeting began with rehearsed formality. The board outlined the agenda, framed the situation as a concern about growing parking violations, and subtly implied that the previous night's incident stemmed from a resident who had failed to follow established procedures. They danced around names, but everyone knew who they meant. Eyes shifted toward the homeowner. He waited calmly. The moment stretched. The tension in the room thickened as Patricia finally leaned forward, prepared to anchor the narrative firmly in her favor. She spoke at length about rules, about community order, about how enforcement protected property values. She never admitted to calling 911 unnecessarily. She never acknowledged that the car had been inside the correct property. Instead, she framed herself as the defender of the neighborhood, someone who had taken necessary action when she believed someone was breaking the rules. Her version of events floated over the room like a fog, trying to blur the truth. But the homeowner knew it couldn't last. When she finally finished, he rose from his seat, the garage opener and a printed photo of the video still in his hand. He walked to the front of the room, held the garage opener up, and placed the photo on the table where the entire board could see it. The picture showed the car rolling safely into the garage long before Patricia had called for a tow truck. It froze the exact moment the overhead door closed. Silence swept across the room. Neighbors leaned forward, their curiosity sharpening into focus. The board stiffened, caught between defensiveness and the undeniable evidence in front of them. The homeowner let the moment settle. The weight of the truth hung in the air, leaving the board no space to twist the situation. The garage opener clicked in the homeowner's hand as he activated it. The signal reached the house across the street, and although no one could see it from the clubhouse, the neighbors who had stayed outside would witness the door rising and falling in real time. The opener worked. The car belonged there. Murmurs rippled through the room. People exchanged looks that spoke louder than words. Doubt spread not toward the homeowner, but toward the board itself. The fallout from the towing attempt settled over the neighborhood like early morning fog, dense and lingering, clinging to every conversation and every sideways glance from the people who pretended they weren't watching. The HOA board tried to carry on as though nothing unusual had happened, but the residents felt the tension. Something had shifted. A line had been crossed. And the only person who didn't seem to understand that was the board member who had called 911 in the first place. He acted as though he had been the victim, not the instigator. He moved around the neighborhood with the confidence of someone who believed rules were only meant for other people. When he passed neighbors during his morning walk, he greeted them with the satisfaction of someone who assumed the entire community supported him. They didn't, but he was too wrapped up in his own certainty to notice. Meanwhile, the neighborhood group chats buzzed nonstop. People replayed the patrol officer's reaction, the way the officer had stared at the garage door opener in my hand, the way the simple press of a button had exposed everything. The proof had been so clear, so fast, and so public that the story spread before I could even consider whether I wanted it to. I didn't start any conversations about it, but it didn't matter. The neighborhood talked on its own. Despite all of this, the HOA board refused to address the real issue. They sent no apology, no acknowledgement, no explanation. The only communication that arrived was a notice about an emergency meeting scheduled for the following week. It didn't say what the meeting was about, but everyone knew. They were scrambling. They were trying to regain control. And the board member who had caused the chaos was determined to make sure the narrative stayed in his favor. In the days that followed, subtle shifts took place. Neighbors who normally kept their distance began passing by my driveway a little more slowly, nodding in a way that suggested support rather than curiosity. A few waved. One left a note that simply said the board had gone too far this time. Small gestures, but meaningful. It showed the story had resonated in a way the board never expected. By contrast, the board member became increasingly uneasy. His confidence cracked, though he tried to hide it. When he drove past my house, he stared harder than before, as though searching for a flaw in my property to justify what he'd done. But every time he looked, he found nothing out of place, and that seemed to bother him more than anything. The tension built as the meeting approached. People whispered about attending even if they hadn't gone to an HOA meeting in years. Others planned to record the proceedings, expecting something dramatic. The board wanted the situation to disappear quietly. The residents wanted answers. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I simply wanted clarity on why someone had felt so entitled to weaponize the HOA against me. By the time the meeting day arrived, the atmosphere felt like a pot left on a stove too long. Every small sound, every minor interaction hinted at a community on edge. Chairs filled quickly. The board sat in a stiff line across the front of the room, trying to project composure, but their expressions told a different story. The board member in question sat in the middle, arms crossed, jaw tight, tapping his foot like someone waiting for an inevitable confrontation. The residents packed the room and overflowed into the hallway. People stood along the walls. Some held printed copies of the HOA bylaws, highlighted and marked with notes. Others had screenshots from the neighborhood group chats ready to bring them up if needed. The meeting hadn't even started, yet the tension filled every seat. When the board began, they talked in circles. They rambled through procedural topics no one cared about, trying to bury the main issue under layers of formalities. But the room didn't let them. Every person present waited for the moment they would be forced to confront the towing incident. Eventually, they could no longer avoid it. The conversation shifted, and the board member straightened in his chair. He leaned forward with the conviction of someone ready to defend himself at all costs. But before he could launch into whatever speech he had prepared, the residents cut through the silence with the pressure of collective frustration. The questions came fast. Why had he called 911 without verifying ownership? Why had he insisted the towing was justified when it wasn't? Why had the board backed him even after evidence proved him wrong? Why had no corrections or retractions been sent out? And perhaps most importantly, what gave him the authority to target a resident based on personal assumptions rather than actual violations? He tried to respond. He tried to defend himself. But every explanation he offered only made things worse. He blamed miscommunication, then confusing parking rules, then security concerns, then neighborhood safety. None of it held up. Each time he opened his mouth, another resident countered with a fact, a rule, or a first-hand account. The board member grew more agitated as the pressure mounted. His composure cracked. His voice grew louder, then sharper, then desperate. He tried to shift blame onto the HOA handbook. He tried to redirect the attention onto irrelevant neighborhood issues. He even tried to accuse me of being uncooperative until someone reminded him the entire incident had taken place without me present at all. When the room finally quieted, the weight of his conduct sat heavy between everyone seated there. The board members exchanged nervous glances. They understood what the residents wanted, and they understood what would happen if they tried to ignore it. The community had reached its limit, and the board had no choice but to respond. By the end of the meeting, the board announced that the next session would include a formal vote on disciplinary action. It would be open to the entire community. And unlike past decisions made behind closed doors, this one would not happen quietly. The board members' reactions said everything. Shock,
then disbelief, then simmering anger. He stared at his fellow board members as though they had betrayed him. They hadn't. They were simply trying to save themselves from the fallout he had created. And as the meeting adjourned and the crowd filed out, it became clear the situation was far from over. The real fight was still ahead. The next chapter would begin with a vote that could change the entire direction of the HOA and the balance of power inside the neighborhood.
The fallout from the tow truck incident settled over the neighborhood like a low, restless fog. People walked their dogs a little slower, looked over their shoulders a bit more, and watched the HOA board with a new level of caution. Even those who normally ignored community politics now understood that the board, especially its most aggressive member, had crossed a line. But the board didn't pull back. Instead, they tightened their grip. A new round of notices went out, written in the same sharp tone, circling the same threats. It was clear someone wanted to prove that HOA still held authority. And although the letters didn't mention the investigation directly, the message was obvious: compliance at all costs. My garage opener remained at the center of everything, quietly sitting in my hand whenever I walked to or from my car. It wasn't just a device anymore. It had become a symbol of the truth, a silent witness that had seen what really happened that night. The people who believed the board were starting to look uneasy, and the ones who doubted them were becoming vocal. For the first time, the board looked less like a unified front and more like a wall with hairline cracks forming across its surface. The tougher part came when the HOA called an emergency meeting. They packed the room with charts, binders, and a projector that flickered weakly against the beige meeting room wall. They tried to paint the situation as a misunderstanding. They insisted the board member who called 911 acted in good faith, even though none of their explanation lined up with what actually happened. And every time they circled back to the accusation that my car had been parked in violation, the memory of that garage door rising in front of the officers replayed itself clearly in my mind. People asked questions, real ones, pointed ones. The board tried to talk around them, but the evasiveness was obvious. It was the first time the room didn't feel like their territory. For once, they were the ones being cornered. The community sensed it too. A shift had started, gradually but unmistakably. After the meeting, neighbors stopped pretending nothing was wrong. Some came by in private, offering quiet support and sharing stories they'd been too nervous to mention before. Times they felt targeted, notices they thought were unfair, moments they'd tried to ignore because dealing with the HOA usually felt worse than letting something slide. Piece by piece, a pattern became clearer. The board member who tried to tow my car hadn't just been power hungry. He had a habit of pushing boundaries whenever he thought no one was watching. My situation only exposed what others had already felt. But the board wasn't finished. They tried one more tactic, sending me a formal letter questioning whether my garage opener footage should even be considered valid. They claimed it didn't align with HOA parking records, as though paperwork could rewrite what the officers saw with their own eyes. It was the same attempt to twist perception they'd always used, but this time it landed differently. People didn't buy it. Still, the tension grew. You could feel it in the air, the way storm pressure settles before a lightning strikes. Each morning, I checked my car before leaving, half expecting another incident. The board tried to watch me without appearing to, but every time they passed by my house, every time they slowed their walking pace near my driveway, my garage opener felt like a shield. Small but undeniable, proof they couldn't erase. A week after the meeting, the situation escalated again. The board member who started all of this filed a complaint claiming that my car had previously been seen parked improperly, even though no one else supported his claim. He submitted it quietly, thinking it would slide through without attention. Instead, it triggered something he didn't expect. This time, the HOA president stepped in directly, not with support, not with backup, but with frustration. The incident had spiraled beyond anything they could control. The pressure of community backlash, the questions from law enforcement, the whispers about his leadership, it all converged at once. The president didn't defend the board member. Instead, he confronted him privately, a conversation that happened behind a closed door but echoed through the entire HOA when word began to leak. The board member didn't take it well. He came back angrier, more determined, and instead of backing down, he doubled down. He threatened to push for higher fines, more restrictions, stricter enforcement. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about ego, a bruised one. The neighborhood began choosing sides. Some were tired of the chaos and wanted peace no matter who had to apologize. Others were done with being pushed around and wanted accountability. The balance of power in the community was shifting, and everyone could feel it. That's when I realized the situation was headed toward a breaking point. Not just for me, for the whole neighborhood. And that breaking point wasn't going to be quiet. It was going to force the truth out into the open. It was going to change everything. And it was coming soon. The quiet after the tow truck rumbled away didn't last long. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. By noon, people were drifting past my driveway, slowing their steps as if they were trying to act casual. Some pretended to walk their dogs. Others carried empty leashes and no dogs at all. Everyone wanted a look at the garage door that had changed everything. The opener had recorded the entire sequence the night before. The timestamp showed my car pulling in, the door closing, and everything operating like it always did. The HOA board members' claim that my car was illegally parked outside had fallen apart the moment the garage door data was shown. But instead of calming the neighborhood, it created a ripple of tension that pushed people into corners. Those who already disliked the board saw the recording as proof of a pattern. Those who supported the board told anyone who would listen that technology could be faked, and the board itself retreated into silence. By mid-afternoon, an emergency meeting notice went out. The message came in through email, text, and even a printed sheet taped to the community mailbox cluster. The board insisted the matter was not over and urged all residents to attend. The wording felt sharp, almost defensive. It carried the tone of a group fighting to regain control of a situation they were losing their grip on. As the sun dipped behind the houses, cars lined the street leading to the clubhouse. People filled the parking lot and spilled out onto the lawn. Inside, the atmosphere was thick. Residents whispered in low tones, while the board members sat stiffly at a long folding table, each one wearing the same uneasy expression. The board president called the meeting to order. There was no greeting, no warmth, no attempt to calm anyone. Instead, the board launched straight into claims that my garage recording didn't align with HOA policy. They insisted that the garage door opener wasn't an official device for determining compliance. They said the tow request was lawful because the report had been submitted by a board member who believed the vehicle was blocking common property. The room didn't like that explanation. Murmurs rose from all sides. Several neighbors exchanged looks that made the board members fidget. The audience wasn't buying it, and the board could feel the shift. After a tense pause, the board secretary introduced a new piece of information. They announced that they intended to change the parking and garage use rules. According to the proposal, residents would no longer be allowed to rely on personal recording devices as evidence in disputes. Only HOA-approved footage would qualify. The wording suggested the HOA would control what counted as proof. A hush swept over the room, not out of agreement, but disbelief. That was when things took an unexpected turn. A neighbor who rarely attended meetings stepped forward. She was quiet, thoughtful, and not known for confrontations.
Her voice was steady when she reminded the board that state law prohibited HOAs from blocking residents from using their own security footage. The room shifted again. Several others chimed in, mentioning specific cases they had read about. Someone else referenced the HOA's own bylaws. Someone in the back laughed under their breath, and the tension in the air twisted into something sharper. The board president tried to regain control, but the more they spoke, the more obvious their discomfort became. They insisted the rules would stand. They claimed the towing attempt was justified. They repeated that they had full authority over the community. But the words didn't land the way they expected. People were no longer nodding along. Instead, they were taking out their phones, scrolling through screenshots of bylaws and state statutes. What began as a simple dispute about a car had grown into a challenge to the board's power. The residents could feel it. The board could feel it. And I stood near the back, watching the momentum shift from confusion to resolve. Then came the moment that changed everything. A resident wheezed a printed copy of the HOA's annual report. He pointed out a discrepancy, a line item that didn't match the community's known expenses. It was small, but it stood out. It raised questions, and when questions start forming in a crowd already on edge, the spark catches fast. The board members stiffened. Their eyes darted between one another. They tried to downplay the issue, but the resident had backup. Two others stood and mentioned similar irregularities they had noticed over the past year. Each detail added weight to the atmosphere. The parking dispute was no longer the center of the conversation. It had become a doorway that opened into deeper concerns. The meeting spiraled. The board moved to adjourn, but the crowd pushed back, demanding answers. Voices rose, papers rustled, phones recorded. The board managed to call the meeting closed, but they didn't move quickly enough to hide their unease. When the room finally emptied out, the board stayed behind. Their silhouettes through the glass doors looked hunched, cornered, outnumbered. The parking dispute had been their attempt to assert control. Instead, it exposed cracks they didn't want anyone to see. By the time I walked home, neighbors were gathered in small clusters along the street. Everyone talked about what had happened. They whispered about the board's behavior. They traded stories of strange interactions and questionable decisions. People who had never spoken to one another found common ground. The community was shifting, realigning itself without the board's permission. Inside my home, the garage opener sat on the counter where I had left it. That small device, meant only to open and close a door, had become the catalyst for something much larger. The tow attempt was meant to intimidate me, but all it did was reveal how fragile the board's control really was. The consequences would unfold soon enough, and the board, still convinced they had the upper hand, had no idea what was waiting for them in the next chapter. The night was quiet, but the neighborhood was not the same. The fallout from the towing incident didn't settle the way the HOA board expected. Instead of closing the matter, the truth pushed the neighborhood into a strange limbo. People were no longer whispering about what happened. They were openly questioning how far the board had gone and why a simple garage opener had exposed such a tangled mess. The board struggled to contain frustration that didn't fade with time. It only grew sharper. Everyone was waiting for the next move, and it came sooner than anyone expected. The board sent out a new notice, framed as a parking policy clarification. It tried to distance itself from the false report to the police while reinforcing its supposed authority. The message insisted that residents must keep cars fully inside garages whenever possible, and that street parking should be limited to short durations. It didn't reference the tow request directly, but the tone made it clear the board was scrambling to regain control after being exposed. People reacted in different ways. Some felt the board was overreaching again. Others felt the HOA was trying to reestablish order over a situation that had spun out of its hands. A few avoided the conversation entirely, not wanting to get pulled into the tension. But the people closest to what happened saw the letter as an attempt to justify behavior that couldn't be justified.
The board member who had made the tow report, Marianne, didn't apologize or acknowledge anything publicly. Instead, she moved quietly. She watched from a distance whenever I pulled into my driveway. She turned her head at meetings whenever my name came up, avoiding eye contact. She acted as if ignoring the truth might erase it. But the silence became its own kind of confession. One evening, as I arrived home, the neighborhood felt different. Lights were on in every house lining the street. People stood on porches, leaning on railings, or resting their arms on fences. It was the weekly HOA meeting, but no one wanted to go inside the clubhouse. They waited outside, forming small clusters. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Something was about to break. Inside the clubhouse, the board sat behind their long table, their expressions set in stone. They were trying hard to look composed. The room filled quickly. Everyone sensed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary meeting. For weeks, the tension had been building to a point where silence couldn't carry it anymore. The board began with announcements, skimming through landscaping updates and pool maintenance reports. These were the usual attempts to ease an audience into the heavier topics, but no one was listening. People were waiting for the issue that sat like a storm cloud over the room. Eventually, the board reached the parking section of the agenda. Marianne shifted in her seat. She adjusted her papers, even though they were already neat. She braced herself. The president of the board cleared his throat, trying to speak in a way that sounded calm. He referenced the recent misunderstanding involving a vehicle being reported as improperly parked. He explained that the board wanted to reassure the community that protocols had been reviewed and that a new set of rules would help prevent confusion. But the attempted gentleness didn't land. The room tightened. One resident stood up and asked for the board to openly address what actually happened. She insisted the community deserved clarity instead of vague phrasing. More people joined in, one after another, calling for the board to speak frankly about why the police were called to tow a resident's car without proper cause. The board president tried to maintain control, reminding everyone that the board could only discuss items within scope and that accusations weren't productive. But the crowd had no patience for that. They had seen the footage of the garage opener. They had watched months of strict enforcement unravel. They weren't interested in being told to be polite about it. Soon, the room became too loud to ignore. People stood up. Others moved closer. A wave of questions rolled in, each one sharper than the last. Why was the police report filed without checking the property logs? Why did the board issue warnings without verifying details? Why hadn't anyone apologized? Marianne tried to speak, but her words faded under the sound of frustration. The crowd wasn't hostile. They were tired of rules being used as weapons, tired of decisions made from behind closed doors, tired of watching the board twist the truth instead of admitting a mistake. Someone suggested a vote of no confidence. The room reacted instantly. Heads turned toward one another, people whispered. The suggestion wasn't far-fetched anymore. It was logical, even overdue. If the board had acted outside its authority, the community had the right to question whether they should still be in power. The board president tried to regain the floor, but the room didn't settle. The board had lost its grip. The moment felt irreversible. The meeting dragged on for another hour with the board desperately trying to steer it back onto safe ground. They proposed forming a committee to review enforcement practices. They offered town halls. They suggested temporary pauses on citations. But none of it answered the deeper problem. Trust was gone. When the meeting ended, people walked out in quiet clusters. There wasn't the usual chatter or neighborly goodbyes. Everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. The HOA had been challenged openly, publicly, decisively. The power shift was unmistakable. As I walked home, I noticed lights turning on behind living room curtains. Neighbors gathered at dining tables, continuing the discussions that had started in the clubhouse. Some were angry, others thoughtful, but all of them agreed on the same thing. The HOA had crossed the line.
The next morning, the neighborhood woke up with a sense of momentum. People talked in driveways long after their morning routine should have started. Someone posted a poll on the community board proposing a special vote on leadership. The post gathered responses faster than anything the community had seen in years. The board, clearly rattled, sent out another email asking for patience and cooperation. This one was shorter, tighter, written with a tone that didn't hide the urgency. They felt the shift. They sensed the consequences coming.
The morning after the failed towing attempt felt different. The air inside the neighborhood carried a strange tension, a mix of embarrassment, irritation, and anticipation. People walked their dogs slower than usual. Garage doors stayed cracked open just enough for curious eyes to peek out. No one wanted to miss whatever came next. The entire place felt like it was caught halfway between gossip and action, waiting for the next spark to land. After everything that happened with the board member, the guard shack footage, and the garage opener proof, most residents had reached their own quiet conclusion. They knew the truth now. They knew the story the HOA had been selling them for years was a little bent, maybe even completely crooked. They finally saw what I had seen from the first week of moving in, and now they had to decide what they would do with that knowledge. The board felt the shift long before they admitted it. They tried to repair the damage by switching to polite emails, softer notices, and calmer language. Even the president, who usually acted like she ran a private kingdom, tried to look friendly as she made her morning walks. But the change came too late. The neighbors had tasted what it felt like to challenge the board and win. They were not ready to crawl back into silence. That energy started building inside the community group chat. Posts that normally got 2 likes suddenly had 30. People began sharing old stories about fines they once accepted without argument. Someone brought up the time the board approved a landscaping fee increase without a proper vote. Another person mentioned that the pool closure last summer might not have been caused by pipe corrosion, like the board claimed, but by a mismanaged contract the board hid. One by one, these stories lined up like puzzle pieces. By noon, the group was asking for something bigger. Not revenge, not chaos, just truth and accountability. Word spread that several neighbors were meeting that evening near the green belt near the mailbox cluster. Not an official meeting, not even a planned one, just people gathering because they felt it was finally time to talk out loud without the board controlling the narrative. I showed up just to listen. I knew that whatever happened next needed to be their choice, not something forced by me. The group slowly grew from 5 to 15, then 20, then nearly 50 people standing under the fading daylight. They formed small circles at first, swapping stories, comparing fines, checking patterns. A few people brought printed letters they had kept for years. Others had photos on their phones of violations that made no sense. It all built toward one unavoidable conclusion. The board had been using its power like a tool, not a responsibility. Eventually, the small circles merged into one. Someone suggested calling for an official election audit. Another wanted to file a petition for board removal. A couple of quieter residents, who normally kept their thoughts to themselves, started asking whether certain fees had ever been legally approved. It was surprising how much people already knew. They had simply never realized they were not alone. As the sun slipped below the roofs, the group agreed on one thing. They needed a community-wide meeting, a real one, open to everyone, held in a neutral space. The clubhouse had too much history, too much control, too many ways the board could twist attendance or procedure. So they chose the public shoreline park just outside the HOA border. Any attempt by the board to shut it down would look even worse. The meeting was set for 2 nights later. In the hours that followed, the board scrambled. You could almost feel them pushing against the rising momentum, trying to regain control. They sent out an email claiming they were already planning an internal review. They hinted at misunderstanding and miscommunication. They asked residents to wait for updates rather than attending unofficial gatherings that may cause confusion. It didn't work. Every message they sent only fueled the sense that they were trying to block transparency.
The president showed up at several houses that afternoon. She knocked on doors and tried to convince residents that the incident with my car had been exaggerated, but she kept running into the same quiet resistance. People listened politely, then thanked her, and then they still went to the meeting. The night of the shoreline gathering arrived with the energy of a storm front. Flashlights shimmered along the walkway near the water. More than 100 residents showed up. Kids played at the edge of the field while adults formed a circle large enough to touch the edges of the park. It was the first time I had ever seen the neighborhood united for something bigger than holiday decorations. The organizers had prepared a simple structure. They read out a list of recurring complaints: fines without cause, selective enforcement, unannounced rule changes, restrictions that conveniently skipped board members. They showed examples on a small projector powered by a portable battery. But the moment that shifted everything came when a quiet, soft-spoken man walked forward holding a stack of documents. He had served on the board 5 years earlier, but had stepped down because of disagreements he never explained. Now, he revealed everything. He talked about decisions made behind closed doors. He explained how certain votes were counted improperly. He even showed an email chain where the current board president pushed to tighten enforcement on new owners to maintain order. The intention behind those words carried an edge people couldn't ignore. What started as murmurs turned into open disbelief. The former board member placed a final page on the projector. It was a copy of a financial decision made without required approval, a landscaping contract renewed at a higher rate, signed only by the current president and the treasurer. The document had no resident vote, no transparency, and no justification. The crowd reacted like a spark had hit dry grass. From that moment on, the meeting transformed from an open discussion into a movement. Neighbors volunteered to form an election committee. Others offered to review past budgets. Someone suggested pausing all fine collections until fairness could be verified. A few people even spoke about drafting new rules that made every major board decision visible and traceable. The energy build was steady and confident, no longer fueled by frustration alone, but by the belief that the neighborhood deserved to be run with honesty. By the time the gathering ended, the group had created a plan that was organized and focused. A petition for a full board recall would start the next morning. Once enough signatures were gathered, a formal special election would follow. No one expected it to be easy. The board would try to hold on to its power, but the neighborhood had momentum now. And momentum was hard to stop. As people headed home, the president stood across the street near the park entrance, watching the crowd disperse. Her expression carried a kind of stunned disbelief, as if she had never imagined her authority could be questioned by the very people she governed. She turned and walked away without speaking to anyone. Back in my driveway, the night felt unusually quiet. The porch lights down the street blinked on one by one. The board had ruled this place with confidence for a long time, but tonight marked the beginning of the end of that era. What came next would determine whether the neighborhood reclaimed its voice or let the board regain control.
The morning after the chaotic tow attempt settled into a strange quiet. The neighborhood, normally alive with early dog walkers and garage doors sliding open, felt slow and cautious. Word of what had happened had spread through every cul-de-sac. Everyone knew the board member had called 911, claiming your car was abandoned, blocking access, and violating community rules, only for the officers to see you open your garage with the click of a remote. The truth cut through every lie the board had laid out, and the members who had been so sure of their authority were suddenly avoiding eye contact with anyone who might question them. You stepped outside later than usual, wanting to give the street time to settle. The air carried that mix of curiosity and tension, the kind that makes neighbors pretend they aren't watching while keeping their windows cracked open just enough to listen. It was clear the community wanted to see what would happen next. Some were ready for confrontation, others were hoping the situation would fade quietly. But the truth was, the board had crossed a line, and there was no ignoring that. Before noon, the HOA president sent a blanket email to all homeowners. It was filled with vague language about miscommunication, misunderstanding, and unfortunate escalation. Not once did it acknowledge the false report, the misuse of emergency services, or the fact that the board had harassed you over a simple parking matter they never bothered to verify. The message was crafted to hide blame, not accept it. But homeowners weren't buying it. Replies started pouring in, and neighbors who usually stayed silent were now challenging every excuse. They wanted accountability, and they wanted answers. Hours later, the HOA announced an emergency meeting to clarify concerns. That was a sign they were scrambling. You knew they weren't calling it for transparency. They were calling it to contain the fallout. Still, you planned to attend. Whatever they were trying to spin, the truth needed to be heard in front of everyone. When the meeting began that evening, the community room was filled beyond capacity. People lined the walls, stood in corners, and gathered near the doorway in clusters. The board took their seats at the front table, their expressions tight. It was impossible to ignore the shift in power. This time, the room wasn't leaning in their direction. The same board member who had called 911 sat rigid, avoiding every glance. The other members looked uneasy, whispering among themselves, before the president attempted to start the meeting with a forced calm. The script they prepared tried to frame the towing incident as a misunderstanding. They claimed the car had been reported by multiple residents, though no one in the room could identify a single person who had made such a complaint. The more they spoke, the more the tension built. Eventually, the room reached a point where patience ran out. Homeowners began challenging them openly. They wanted to know why the board never checked your property records, which clearly listed the garage number belonging to your unit. They wanted to know why the board member approached your car without asking you directly. They wanted to know why emergency services were dragged into something that could have been resolved with a single knock on a door. It became clear the board had no answers that would satisfy anyone. They shifted the blame repeatedly, but each attempt only made their position weaker. The community wanted accountability, not excuses. When it was your turn to speak, the room quieted. You kept your words measured. You described how you had returned home, how the tow truck had been blocking your driveway, how the board member insisted your car was illegally parked despite having your garage remote in your hand. You explained how the officers saw the truth clearly. You reminded the room that emergency resources had been wasted. You spoke in steady, calm narration, laying out the events in order, step by step, leaving no space for misinterpretation. The silence in the room when you finished carried more weight than any rebuttal. The board had nothing left to stand on. The truth had been laid out plainly, and the community had heard every detail. The president attempted to respond, but the homeowners weren't interested. The temperature of the room had shifted completely. People began calling not for clarification, but for accountability. The call for a vote came next. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't on the agenda. It came naturally, almost organically, from the frustration of the community. Someone suggested removal of the board member responsible for the 911 call. Another demanded an audit of all recent HOA actions. More voices joined, building momentum, turning frustration into decision. The board tried to stall. They insisted a vote couldn't happen without proper notice. But homeowners pushed harder. They wanted action now. The tension rose until it was clear the board wouldn't be able to move forward without offering something meaningful. In the end, the board member responsible for calling 911 resigned on the spot. The pressure was too much. The room didn't cheer, but the collective relief was unmistakable. The resignation wasn't victory, but it was closure. The board agreed to review and revise parking policies. They promised clearer communication and verification procedures. For the first time in a long while, they were listening rather than commanding. Later that night, the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet. But it felt different. There was no sense of fear. No one felt watched. No one felt threatened by sudden rule changes or petty enforcement. The air held a sense of reset, as if the community had reclaimed a part of itself that had been slipping away. You returned home with the simple satisfaction of knowing the truth had won. You hadn't needed confrontation or chaos. All it took was patience, clarity, and a garage opener that proved everything. The HOA had crossed a line, but the community pushed them back. And now, the street finally felt like home again.